I will introduce myself. My name is Nate Bauer. I'm the director at the University of Alaska Press. Welcome to Author's Corner for our third presentation of the summer, and thanks again for attending. Thanks to those of you here at UAF's Engineering, Learning, and Innovation Facility for choosing to spend part of another beautiful summer evening in Alaska with us, for sharing your personal space with us. I want to be clear that the University of Alaska Fairbanks still maintains a strict COVID-19 policy of requiring facial coverings and social distancing inside all buildings for anyone who is not fully vaccinated. Thanks to those of you who are tuning in to the live stream of the video or the video recording later on from Alaska or elsewhere. Thank you for your interest and attention, and thanks to the University of Alaska Office of Information Technology and their personnel for making this happen. Big thanks also to Michelle Bartlett and Summer Sessions for these fun and stimulating summer event series free of charge. Thanks to tonight's presenter, Katie Eberhart, and all of our UA Press authors for agreeing to participate in these readings in the Author's Corner series this summer. I hope you will all make it worth their while. We will have books for sale after Katie's talk out there in the library or in the lobby area. If you're watching or listening to the stream, you can find more information and a purchase link for Katie's book, Cabin 135, at the UA Press website, alaska.edu/UA Press. I'd also like to offer a special thanks to Peggy Shoemaker, the founder and special editor of UA Press's Alaska Literary Series, of which Cabin 135 is a recent entry. I think we will have some good time for questions at the end of Katie's presentation, so please consider any information and details you'd like to hear more about as you listen to her tonight. We'll have a microphone here that we'll be happy to pass around or bring to you for any questions here in the room. We'll kindly ask you to use it for the benefit of the presenter and for those listening online. For anyone zooming in, please use the Google Form link on the live stream page below the video pane on the screen you're looking at, or visit bit.ly/author Q&A. That's bit.ly/author Q&A, no spaces. I also hope that while you're at the summer session site, you'll consult the calendar for the rest of the summer and make plans to attend any other events that interest you. We will post the rest of the scheduled Author's Corner presentations at the conclusion of tonight's event. Other events this week include Dr. Rommel Wren of Fairbanks Memorial Hospital for the Healthy Living series on Tuesday, Andy Seitz of the Alaska Hydrokinetic Energy Center for the Discovery Alaska series on Wednesday evening, and Kinky Slinky for Music in the Garden on Thursday. Thank you. Katie Eberhardt has a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from the Rainier Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University and degrees in geography and economics. Katie's poetry, essays, and articles have appeared in print and online, and she has taught writing workshops in Alaska and Oregon and on a hillside in Greenland. Katie's chapbook, Unbound Alaska Poems, was published by Uttered Chaos Press in 2013, and her book, Cabin 135, A Memoir of Alaska, was published by the University of Alaska Press as part of our Alaska Literary Series in December of 2020. Please join me in welcoming Katie Eberhardt.
Okay. Hello, everyone. And I have a question. Am I on now?
Yes, you are currently on.
Okay. Okay. So I'm like, I have the full screen and I'll just checking because, okay, this is strange. Okay. So hi, everyone. Everyone up at UAF and everyone listening online. Very happy to be here. And let's see. Okay, so let's see. Wonder if I could just thinking about this. Oh no, oh, wait a sec. Okay, I'm just messing with my view for a minute to see if I can get it so that it looks any better. Okay, so since Nate didn't show the cover of my book, I'm going to start with that. And Cabin 135, A Memoir of Alaska, and the cover art is by Ruth Hulbert, who is an Alaskan. and lives in Alaska, has been there all her life. And in the book also, Ruth created a map, which just so that you can see that we have a lot of places in my book. And cabin 135 is a house that was built during the Matanuska colony in the Matanuska Valley in 1935. And the house is one that my husband and I moved to in 1983. And we lived there for almost 30 years. So the house is a really huge character in this book. But I'm also interested in a lot more than just the house. And that even though in the book, the house anchors the story, I keep returning to the house over and over again. So the house is one of the grounding characters in the book. However, I have decided not to read about the house tonight because the book is way larger than one house, one garden, one yard. And you can think of the stories in this book as concentric, maybe concentric circles, you know, like throwing a pebble into a pool of water and how that all radiates outward. So the book is also about my questions about the surroundings. I mean, sort of a more explorations of ideas and how the world we live in fits together, but from my own point of view. So if you haven't read this book yet and you decide to, you'll find out that there are a lot of sections and there's a scheme of repeating headings, because one of the ways, let's see, that I sort of process the world in my mind ignores time. It's a strange thing, but like with your memory, you can be here wherever you are right this moment, but in a heartbeat, in an instant, you can be in your mind somewhere from your childhood or some place you read in a book that grabbed you and stayed with you. And so as I was writing this book, I was trying to allow for that interconnection of experience and ideas. Okay, so as I read, there will be like a little pause now and then when I will say a word like time or ice or Arctic. And if I was reading a different section in the book, I would say cabin or let's see, terrain, that sort of thing. So I have decided tonight, because of all the information out and people in the Western US experiencing one of the worst droughts in a very long time and heat waves and everything else, that I'm going to read about the Arctic. So this is, let's see, and the characters, my husband's name is Chuck. You'll need to know that. And I think the rest of the characters in this section you'll know who they are by listening. Okay, and then I'm also going to say that I'm going to read one entire section straight through rather than jumping around to give a flavor of all the different ways that I present ideas in this book. This is going to be one section, and it's in the last third of the book. Arctic. When I mentioned to my sister Barbara that Chuck and I planned to drive to the Arctic Ocean, she laughed. The Arctic? Wouldn't Hawaii be a nice beach vacation? She asked. Everyone goes to Hawaii, I replied. Do you know anyone who has driven to the Arctic Ocean? Not yet, she replied cheerily. Time. With the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, the United States became a nation with more than a theoretical interest in the Arctic. There have been many Arctic expeditions, some familiar, like the race to the North Pole or seeking the Northwest Passage, others less well known, like a search for land that had been speculatively reported in the Arctic Basin. I became interested in this topic when I came across a book by Ernst de Koven-Leffingwell and Agnar Mikkelsen. These men from the United States and Denmark set off in 1906 to prove or disprove the existence of land north of Alaska. There had been reports of land and theories verifying the presence and theories for verifying the presence or absence of such land related to tides, currents, and the behavior of the sea ice. In 1909, Mikkelsen wrote, "The ice, which is a characteristic feature of the Beaufort Sea, is indeed so heavy and old that it is hard to explain how ice of so formidable a size can be formed in an open polar sea, where the ice is continually drifting out and getting renewed." Arctic. Of course, an expedition needs a goal, often stated as a compelling question, such as, is there land? Or now, traveling to the Arctic, we ask, is there ice? And we can drive and look for ourselves, which is exactly what Chuck and I did during the summer of 2007. We would not be hampered by ships stuck in the ice, nor would we have to kill and eat sled dogs when the going got tough. We would simply pack food and camping gear in the back of our pickup and go. We planned to camp the first night in Fairbanks, 300 miles north of our house. By early evening, with the sun still up, we drove slowly through the Chena River campground. Finding every site occupied, we drove on past malls and stores. We filled the gas tank when we thought we were near the edge of the city because our traveler's guide showed only 2 gas stations between Fairbanks and the Arctic coast. Continuing north, shadows deepened in the creases between forested hills, and homes and cabins became more sparse until there were none. We stopped at the Wickersham Dome pullout and switched drivers. So I drove and peered at the sides of the road, looking for a place to camp. We had no concerns about darkness because in summer, the far north remains a bright twilight all night. Whether a curve in the road or forest obscured my view, suddenly a wider area appeared. I braked and turned into what might once have been a wayside or campground, but there were no picnic tables, toilets, or running water. A motorhome idled nearby, and there was another car parked and a tent half hidden in the trees. After eating meat and potatoes and pitching our tent, we walked into the woods along Catalina Creek, where we discovered the steel superstructure of an abandoned bridge, faded to a sickly pink and overrun by forest. The next morning, I woke slowly, listening to the rumble of a truck engine and a motorhome's generator. We boiled water for coffee, ate cereal, and repacked the pickup. We had passed pump station 7, but had not yet reached the turnoff from the Elliott Highway onto the Dalton Highway. Intermittently between the hills, we saw the oil pipeline, a substantial presence constructed of tubular steel, 48 inches in diameter. Over its length, the pipeline is supported by 78,000 posts called vertical support members. The VSMs elevate the warmer pipe to protect the permafrost from melting. The pipeline has a rugged grace, like an uncoiled snake, and from a distance appears like twine stretched across the variable terrain. Besides tracing topography, in places the pipeline zigzags to allow for expansion and contraction, as well as movement, which may occur during an earthquake. Oil. The largest oil reserves in North America were discovered in Prudhoe Bay, at Prudhoe Bay in 1968. 5 years later, OPEC targeted the United States and other countries with an oil embargo. The embargo caused shortages and rationing in the United States, along with an increase in price. In 1974, a year after the oil crisis, construction began on the Trans-Alaska pipeline system. 3 years later, oil began to flow. Prudhoe Bay is where the Trans-Alaska pipeline system begins and the Dalton Highway ends. It's where oil is pumped and shipped south on an 800-mile journey through the pipeline to be loaded onto tankers in Valdez. Dead Horse is an industrial enclave next to Prudhoe Bay, the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. It has few permanent residents, but thousands of workers who travel there for weeks-long shifts, then return to their homes. Time. During the time crews braved Arctic conditions to build the Trans-Alaska pipeline, Artists Jean-Claude and Christo planned and built Running Fence, a wall of fabric that traversed 24.5 miles of California hills. Running Fence was constructed using 240,000 square yards of heavy woven white nylon fabric, 2,050 steel poles, 350,000 hooks, and 13,000 earth anchors. I'm struck by the large numbers, thousands of hooks and poles and anchors needed to build even a transient structure across miles of terrain. Running Fence hung across California hills for 2 weeks in 1976 and then was dismantled. Whether built for art or effect, a wall has the capacity to inspire imagination and even steer us to consider other contrivances or constructs that cross the landscape. Christo's fabric fence would have made a weak border, but the effect was surely one of wonder. Even decades later, I marvel that Running Fence materialized at all. It suggests determination, durability of ideas, and a poetic vision. Like poetry and art, Running Fence may have caused people who saw it to think about landscape differently, perhaps considering the scene to be more flexible. Like when a painter adds or subtracts with the sweep of a brush, and this perhaps exactly because Running Fence had no practical purpose. To interpret the meaning of draped fabric that meanders across ridges and valleys is unlike contemplating an industrial object, like a pipeline. Yet anything we build across the terrain is, by nature, transitory. Only the timelines differ. Arctic. Where the Dalton Highway crosses the Yukon, the river is nearly a half-mile wide. The road was muddy and a large truck was gaining on us when we approached the bridge. Our pickup bounced over potholed wooden decking, and I had an unsettling view from the passenger window of the Yukon's fast-flowing green waters far below. The bouncing made the seatbelt tighten unpleasantly, and although Chuck had a firm grip on the steering wheel, I wished he was driving slower. Time. A road is like a thread with knots for memories or moments of wonder or perplexity, and the pipeline is the reason that a Dalton Highway exists at all. They are a pair twinned across the terrain, creating a narrow corridor of civilization. If you parked and walked away from the road, you would quickly find wilderness, something that has long fastened explorers as well as armchair travelers. Wilderness is place and idea and the absence of human influence. By definition, wilderness is uncultivated and uninhabited, or in some cases unsettled. But a definition suggests interpretation, labeling, and judgment. And you must ask, what is uninhabited? Does a temporary hunting camp count as habitation? Does the word settled suggest colonizing? In an older version of the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of wild is less troubling. Wild is a word that can be attached to many others: wildfowl, wildcat, wildflower, wildfire, wild land. Wild also can represent unsound or reckless decisions. Wildness might be a place in an uncultivated state, and evidently going after something unlikely to be found has long been known as a wild goose chase. Along the Dalton Highway, there is certainly no cultivation, so it must be wild land, yet wilderness is not so easily proved. People use the land for hunting and fishing and traveling, but it doesn't take vast tracts to meet up with the definition of wilderness. Even a city block will do, where rain seeps into sidewalk cracks and seeds sprout, and if unchecked, deterioration is speeded by roots and the frost's wedging action. An industrial road that abuts wildland land has rules and traffic. Trucks have the right of way, and other travelers pull to the side each time a truck appears. Barry Lopez, in his book Arctic Dreams, described driving the Hall Road in the early 1980s. Quote, "For miles at a time, we were the only vehicle. Then a tractor-trailer truck, pugnacious and hell-bent, would shoulder past us, flailing us with gravel," unquote. Times change. In 2007, tractor-trailer rigs traveling the Dalton Highway seemed cautiously hurried rather than pugnacious and hell-bent. and flailing gravel didn't trouble us. Arctic. We cross invisible lines every day, latitude and longitude, city, state, and county boundaries. But the greatness of the Arctic Circle is that it symbolizes the Earth's tilt and the timing of seasons, exemplified by perpetual daylight of a far north summer. With the Arctic Circle sign as backdrop, Chuck and I set up tripod and camera and were photographing ourselves when a disheveled couple approached and asked if we would take their picture. They said this photo would provide proof that ended their quest to visit all 50 states. They looked exhausted, as if they had been sleeping in their car for weeks. The woman donned a floppy brimmed hat like it was her photo op hat, and the couple, smiling tensely, posed in front of the Arctic Circle sign. I imagined the photo on Christmas cards with the caption, "We did it." Later, I learned that as a consequence of shifts in the Earth's tilt, the Arctic Circle is drifting north at the rate of nearly 50 feet a year. Now I wonder whether the signage was only for entertainment purposes, because the real Arctic Circle had detached from its designated latitude and we were all being bamboozled. Okay, I think I am going to, looking at the time, I am going to just skip a little bit. Let's see here. Because I want to get to the end of this section too. Okay, so I'm going to skip us across the Brooks Range, kind of a big jump, and go on from there. Terrain. Driving across the Arctic plain, we stopped frequently to watch birds, gulls, and long-tailed Jaegers swooping above the tundra, and an Arctic loon cavorting on a satiny blue lake. The loon splashed, preened, dived, and rolled, so his chest flashed white above the water. Then he lurched upright and fanned his wings. A female loon serenely paddled nearby. On the far side of the lake, a pair of tundra swans swam, shielding four cygnets between them. Time. Approaching Dead Horse, where the roadway nears the Sagavanirktok, the Sag River, we stopped and looked through binoculars at a herd of musk oxen grazing along the opposite bank. Although I had seen captive musk oxen at the muskox farm near Palmer, the wild herd offered hopefulness for long-term species survival. Like woolly mammoths, herds of musk oxen roamed the Arctic during the Pleistocene era. Unlike mammoths, musk oxen beat the survival odds, except the musk oxen foraging along the Sag were not descended from herds that migrated from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge. In the early 20th century, these musk oxen were hunted to extinction. It takes will and resources to reverse extinction. The species must still exist somewhere in order to be reestablished. The musk oxen we watched along the Sag River were descended from musk oxen transported from Greenland in 1935, which, by the way, was the same year Cabin 135 was built. Switzerland. After hiking around Le Durberance Valley with Chuck's cousin, Irene, we departed the same way we had come in Irene's car through the nerve-wracking one-lane tunnel. Dodging an approaching vehicle, Irene abruptly stopped in one of the arched alcoves. We climbed out and leaned on the stone wall. Breezes welled up from the deep valley. Below us, an eagle-sized bird soared. "I don't believe it. I really don't believe it," Irene exclaimed. "A jeepayet." "What's that?" I asked. "Jeepayets," Irene explained, "were hunted to extinction because farmers thought the birds killed lambs. Later, they learned that jeepayets only scavenged after birth." "That sounds like a vulture," I commented. "They are a vulture. The bird is called Bartgeier in German, which means bearded vulture." Irene continued, "A few years ago, Switzerland acquired some pairs of jeepayets from Turkey, but the location where they were released was kept a secret." While we watched, the jeepayet soared upward and landed on a stony ledge across the canyon. I focused my binoculars. Could the pile of sticks on the ledge be a nest? I wondered aloud. Time. I'm glad to hear about reintroductions of regionally extinct species like Gpiet in Switzerland and muskox on Alaska's Arctic plain. But I wonder about species now on the brink of extinction. The endangered list is much longer than I thought. What will future people think of us? I imagine they will be as baffled that we didn't figure out solutions as I am with past people who allowed wanton hunting and decimation of species, some well known like the dodo and passenger pigeon, others less so like the Carolina parakeet, aurochs, the great auk, and Steller's sea cow. More troubling than thinking that future generations will judge us as inept or inattentive is the actual ecological impact of oceans acidifying, ice sheets and glaciers melting, sea levels rising, deforestation, and other recent ecological shifts. So I have a little bit of a jump that includes Iceland. And if you were reading the whole book, this would make sense instead of seeming really out of context. Iceland's loss of forests 1,000 years ago suggests both case study and metaphor, as does the migration of farmers to the Matanuska colony in 1935. Arctic. Late afternoon of our third day journeying north, we drove into the enclave of Dead Horse on a gravel road elevated above pools of water. A caribou, its hide like a moth-chewed sweater, loitered on the road berm. Breezes swirled gritty dust in front of us. Our first stop was at the only gas station, unattended and self-serve, with an unusual configuration. Pump controls inside a small room presumably prevented the mechanisms from freezing during Arctic winters. We checked in at the Caribou Inn, lodging assembled from metal sheathed modules perched atop pilings, intended to avoid melting the permafrost. More foreign than I expected, Dead Horse evoked the off-kilter graininess of an old black and white movie, but with the paradigm shift effect of a Star Wars space station. Later that evening, after a meat and potatoes dinner at the hotel cafeteria, Chuck and I tromped along gravel streets in a brisk wind that swirled dust and riffled a small lake. To the north, the sun shone weakly above low-slung clouds. Glimpsing the so-called midnight sun above the Arctic shore would clinch my idea of the Arctic as truly exotic. Seeing sea ice would offer a measure of hopefulness. Some shore birds, semi-palmated plovers, and a solitary sandpiper behaved as if oblivious to the industrial landscape and the occasional passage of a pickup truck. But while walking, we startled a flock of red-necked phalaropes that flew up from a puddle-sized pond, circled and alighted in the same place. Tiny sandpipers that we couldn't identify stalked the edge of a large puddle beside a boxy building. As we trekked along the dusty berm-perched byways to the north, pink-tinged clouds grew taller until they hid the sun. Maybe under different conditions, the clouds would have appeared as mirages, fabulous castles or mythical mountain ranges that might be mistaken for distant land, but these clouds were indeed real. They spread slowly inland like pink cotton, and we returned to our worn yet warm hotel room. In the night, I woke to the rattle of rain against metal walls, and the next morning, Chuck and I stood in the hotel's cafeteria line along with oil company employees wearing heavy work gear. We filled our plates with eggs, sausage, and toast, and after eating, waited in front of the hotel for the tour to the Arctic shore. Eventually, a van showed up, and as we boarded, the driver checked our names off a list. We shared the shuttle with a couple from Alberta who said they'd been camping, and we remembered seeing a tent beaten by wind near the Sag River. A fashionably dressed couple we had noticed at dinner in the cafeteria also boarded the van. They appeared nonplussed, as if they had stepped off the plane into a place misrepresented by the tourism brochures. The no-frills van turned out to be a repurposed airport shuttle with towels neatly stacked on the luggage rack, and the driver introduced himself as a retired policeman from Arizona. The nighttime rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle. I rubbed steam off my window to better see rows of enormous rolligons, vehicles with gigantic low-pressure tires that spread weight more broadly to avoid damaging the fragile tundra. The oversized rigs looked like they'd been repurposed from a science fiction movie. Or had movie designers used industrial rolligons as inspiration for their sets? To reach the Arctic Ocean at all, We had to submit proof of identity ahead of time, which the van driver claimed let him vouch for us at the gate. In an odd way, that seemed apropos to the melancholy of the accelerating rain, as did the van driver's tiff with a road grader operator regarding who got the right of way on the narrow road. I was certain the small van would lose in a full-fledged confrontation with the heavy-bladed machine, but the van sneaked past. After that, the tour was mostly the driver reading names of companies from signs on buildings. At the beach, he turned the van and parked facing inland. As we exited, he said, "Feel free to swim. There are plenty of towels, but no diving because the water is too shallow." Seemingly as an afterthought, he added, "Watch out for polar bears." "Are you worried about polar bears?" I asked Chuck as I zipped my raincoat. "No," Chuck said. "They're probably out on the sea ice." "So you don't think we'll see a polar bear?" I asked, wondering what we would do out at the end of the long jetty if a polar bear lumbered out of the ocean. "No," Chuck replied. "There's no sea ice here." And the van driver would surely have mentioned if polar bears were roaming the shore, or there wouldn't have been a tour at all. I'm not so sure. I would like to see the Arctic ice pack, though," I commented. We walked through chilly rain beside seawater as somber as the misty clouds. At the end of the jetty, we turned and hiked back to the van. As I recall, the Albertans went swimming. Time. Cross the Arctic Basin from Prudhoe Bay, and you will skirt the North Pole and eventually reach Norway. You will not see a landmass in the center of the Arctic, although you will see ice, but there is some question as to how much. In 1906, Michelson and Leffingwell's expedition was plagued by ice. First, they planned to commission whalers to haul their gear north, but most of the whaling ships were stuck in the ice. So they bought a sailing schooner, the Duchess of Bedford, which was subsequently lost in the ice. Michelson and Leffingwell spent nearly 2 months crossing ice in the Beaufort Sea with sledges and dogs, recording weather, sea depth, and describing the ice, proving the continental shelf was narrow and that no additional landmass exists north of Alaska. Michelson's and Leffingwell's chronicles provide us with information and data as to the condition of the Arctic ice a century ago, like a message in a bottle from the past. Arctic. In my best case tourism scenario, glimpsing the Arctic Ocean ice pack would have symbolized hope, like a dove alighting on the railing of the ark. But we couldn't gawk at ocean ice, tongues and ridges, because in July, the ice would be far offshore, and because the expanse of Arctic ice has been hugely reduced by our warming climate. Unlike Michelson and Leffingwell's expedition, our journey proved nothing. Walking in rain on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, Chuck and I saw no ice. If we had beheld ice, not just cold rain and a flat gray sea, I would have felt more optimistic, but that likely would have been because I allowed the sighting more veracity than it deserved. Okay, that, missing, except for a few pages in the middle, that was that section. And let's see. I will read another short one unless Nate or somebody says that we should go to questions right now. This will be really short.
I say go for it, Katie.
Okay, okay. Okay, just to give all of you who are listening a flavor for the house, because, Cabin 135, you would think the book's about the house, but it's about so much more. So I'm skipping back to, in the book, I'm on page 92 now. So in the first third, and here's about, a couple pages. Cabin. Surely February is the least likely month to sell a house in Alaska. Inconveniences abound. Freezing weather precludes outdoor painting. Wind and storms forestall chores like shuffling excess belongings to another location. Someone house hunting in February would need to look beyond dirty snowdrifts, drafty doorways, frosted windows, and drearily lit rooms. To buy an Alaska house in winter, you would have to be attuned only to potentialities, anticipating summer, imagining abundant daylight and profusions of greenery. By the time we bought cabin 135, it had changed ownership 4 times, including twice in February. After nearly 20 years, the first owners, the LaRoses, sold to a fellow named Yadon in April, often still winter in Alaska. 3 years later, in February 1957, Yadon sold to Hugh Adams, and 5 years after that, again in February, the Webbs bought the colony-era cabin from Adams. Chuck and I bought the house in May. But judging from the faded for sale sign, the house had been on the market all winter. May begins with lawns like dried buckskin and trees, a network of twigs, catkins, a quiver. A week or two later, verdure drifts across forest and garden. February, though, is the heart of winter with warm days still several months off. I suspect the house of complicity in an owner's desire to sell during winter. And I marvel that any buyer came forth at all. Perhaps the house wished to shake off inhabitants like a dog flings water after a swim. Maybe the house played little jokes with heat or electricity, or was in cahoots with the wind, loosening the door latch, welcoming Arctic blasts, and chortling like an uncle who devises a prank that no one else finds hilarious. Selling in winter probably had a logical explanation related to the owner's personal circumstances, a change of job or health, although I would never discount the influence of blowing snow, sub-zero chill, incessant chattering of the Matanuska, and even the house's antics. And okay, so Nate, I can go on from there, or that is a good stopping point.
Let me take the temperature of the room a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you. Great so far, Katie. Terrific.
Okay.
I think I'm excited to hear from folks if there are questions in the room, or if anybody's online. I would encourage you again to click the link and submit questions. I've got the spreadsheet open in case anybody wants to submit questions that way. But maybe we'll start here in the room if people just want to raise their hands if people have questions. And if there are no questions, maybe we'll encourage Katie to forge ahead. But I think it's nice to take a pause. Any opinions here in the room? Yeah, Paulo here.
Who was the second owner of the house? I couldn't hear.
Oh gosh, the second owner of the house. Okay.
It sounded like
I
you
will
said
go back.
Gagan.
Oh, yeah, Yadon. It's spelled Yadon.
Okay, I was wondering if you were saying Gagan, which is
Oh,
he was a linguist that lived in Fairbanks, and his brother ran the Sullivan Roadhouse. But he was the best linguist in the world and lived in Fairbanks most of his life. Different person, spelled differently.
okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, Katie, I have a question or two, but maybe we can save it for the end if you want to continue. I'm enjoying it quite a lot. So.
Okay. Well, that was fun reading a long section because as you know, I had mostly just skipped around. Okay, I think I'll go back to skipping around then. I've still got some things here that let me see. Where do I want to start? Okay. Okay, just give me a second. Oh yeah, I'll read some more about the house. The house was probably at the time not, sort of aggravating, but okay, still in the first 50 pages. Cabin. The house did not come with an owner's manual, although in the basement, cardboard labels dangling from copper pipes indicated which direction to turn valves in order to switch from the oil furnace to the coal furnace, or vice versa. The oil furnace was situated in the basement. The garage housed the coal burning furnace. Both furnaces heated and pumped water through a system of baseboard radiators. The steep pitch cabin roof transitioned to a nearly flat roof over the garage. Inside the garage, the log house wall had been coated with urethane, a sprayed-on chemical intended for insulation. The original insulation, laid along each log as the walls were being erected, would have been oakum, jute-like fibers embedded with a tarry substance, or maybe moss. The urethane hid the logs and any hint of oakum or moss. A layer of gray paint, as dingy as river silt, did not improve the wall's lumpy appearance. When we moved in, urethane also blanketed the roof, an uncommon roofing material. The inch-thick foam was painted with a silvery compound that was supposed to be waterproof. The shiny surface attracted magpies that pecked holes in the roofing, exposing crisp and porous foam underneath. We hired a roofing contractor who replaced the bird-pecked roofing with composite shingles on the steep cabin roof and hot mopped tar onto the garage roof. The contractors also added 6 inches of insulation to the cabin roof and installed a layer of plywood over the garage roof boards. To increase stability, he said, get this out of my way, at the same time, we did not notice anything structurally amiss in the garage. Earth. Someone else created the raspberry patch, but that time of planting is long forgotten. It's as if this is the right place for raspberries, but tension exists between our desires and nature. Raspberries don't care about my efforts and puny tools, and I'm not the first caretaker who has tried to beat back meadow and forest. In the spring, I raked dried leaves and vaguely sensed blisters blooming inside the gloves on my winter soft palms. My movements acquired a tempo like Gertrude Stein's writing, with rhythm and a bit of ridiculosity. She starts with a light in the moon and ends with a magnificent asparagus and also a fountain, as if the connection is perfectly obvious, as if the sound and rhythm of language is enough to create meaning. What I'm after is taste and quantity, even from one end of the raspberry patch to the other, a distance of only 50 feet, the berries differ. The canes at the north end are weaker and the raspberries smaller and more astringent the nearer the house, nearer the slope where the log crib version of a septic tank was buried. At the north end of the raspberries, the shovel sliced mud and loosened grass. But the next time I stomped it, the blade clunked against ice, not permafrost, but a remnant of winter. Frozen earth blocks drainage of meltwater, and each spring a pool forms in the adjacent hayfield. The shallow pond lingers long enough to attract a few migrating ducks and geese. As the ground thaws, the water percolates downward and the pond vanishes. Weeding raspberries is triage, not surgery. Unlike currants or strawberries, raspberries appear on 2-year-old canes. During their first year, canes grow tall and willowy, spawning a jungle of leaves that hide stickery stems. 2-year-old raspberry canes are branched and easily break, cracking like dry sticks. But they have berries. Canes older than 2 years are faded bones speckled with orange dots that might be lichen or fungus, in any event aiding decomposition. Canes supported by their younger sisters, like siblings, emerge from the same roots. Okay, let's see. You know, Nate, I'll just keep reading until somebody stops me. Let's see here. So the house, I've mentioned the concentric circles as a metaphor for how this book goes into different ideas and different terrain and geography. So I always was thinking of the house at the center of it, and the yard and garden surrounding the house is kind of like the next bit of terrain going outwards. And then very near and to the north of the house was a stretch of forest. So easy access to see northern forest, birch trees, spruce trees, and all of the interesting plants that grow underneath. And if you haven't realize yet, some of this is about how people muck around in the environment And so the first part I read about driving to the Arctic, the mucking around in the environment, had really big economic reasons and was on a massive, vast scale. If you think about the oil pipeline, you think of it even bigger if you think about the climate and the Arctic ice. But where I was living, there was the garden, the raspberry patch. They're, making changes, trying to control the nature that was the raspberry patch. And then there's the forest. So I had easy access to the forest. Didn't do as much there, but here's another short section. Forest. On the lookout for spring, I prowled the woods behind the house, intent on finding the orchids as soon as they erupted, like pale winter legs through dry leaves. Orchids were a new occupant. There hadn't been any in this scrap of forest until I spied some at a nursery. Like the inclination to rescue a puppy from a shelter, I bought a pot of fairy slippers called Calypso bulbosa, hoping to find a suitable site for them in the forest north of the house. Birch and spruce had been growing and falling and rotting there for a very long time, centuries probably, or millennia. I knew, though, that grass, wildflowers, and shrubs grew more densely than in predominantly spruce forests, where colonies of orchids flourished along moss-covered humps of rotted logs. I lay on my stomach between thorny stems and pale shoots of wild geraniums. Sun dappled the forest floor and my back. Mere inches tall, the orchids bristled with brushy yellow centers flanked by pink petals like the wings of a miniature tropical bird. An orange-butted bumblebee buzzed past my face and plunked onto a tiny orchid that swayed beneath her weight. The bee wallowed in pollen, then leaned, reaching and clambering onto another bloom, where she lost her grip and slid down the stem. Instead of climbing, she whirred upward. Alighting on another orchid, the bumblebee, her legs already thickly coated with pollen, resumed her labor. I had a front row seat, so to speak, lying on my belly in dry leaves, contemplating bumblebee and orchid. This view of nature was small and quiet and personal. The scene felt almost invisible, and it would have been for anyone who never ventures into the forest or who doesn't look down. I was watching an enduring ritual, yet my actions were part of the story. I had purchased the orchid. I had planted it there. I hoped it would thrive. Although I wondered about the origin of that orchid, what rotting tree had it been lifted from for a mercenary endeavor? I hoped the orchid had been raised specifically for the plant nursery, but I had my doubts. Okay, Nate, how about those
Terrific.
questions?
Thank you, Katie.
Welcome.
Yeah, I do have a few things that I'm pretty curious about, but I do want to defer to the audience here. So I'm 100% confident that just about everybody here has at least a question or two in their head that they're curious about and they kind of want to ask, but they're reluctant to do so. So please,
Okay.
please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question. But to prime the pump, so to speak, I guess I have some things I'm curious about. I wonder, first of all, Katie, if you could talk about the genre of memoir. Of course, it's not a new genre, but I think that it's always undergoing change, and I think as a creative form, I think it's just pretty interesting. And this is kind of a selfish question because I find like that I'm always kind of having to explain what memoir is from my perspective to prospective authors and to readers and stuff. So, can you just say something about your relationship to the genre of memoir and how you kind of interpreted it when you were creating the book?
Oh gosh, how long do I have?
About 10 minutes.
Okay, well, this book began as a collection of essays. I did not think of memoir on my own. My background as an economist suggests that I have an affinity for data and a lot of structure. And so I was looking for structure with the essay writing form, and also perhaps not having to work so hard on creating transitions between ideas and and stories. So when I was encouraged to go to Memoir, to recast the book, revise it in the form of memoir, of course, I had to like think about that and also think of my relationship to writing about myself. With an essay, you can duck some of the writing about yourself, or decide where the boundaries are on what I wrote about. So let's see, so what I try to do, I think I'm just going to have to answer this question from my own experience rather than talking about, what is memoir? I mean, memoir, the word comes or is connected to the word memory, and the author writes their stories, you think, from their memory as they remember them. So in general, that's what's going on with memoir. But in my book, I have a combination. So in a way, I guess it's kind of a hybrid, where I'm talking about my own experience and a little bit about my family's experience, but also finding things that I didn't really want to talk about, and so they're not in here. So what my interests are nature and the environment, and how people, as I mentioned earlier, how people change the environment, whether it's inside a house or nature, the nature that they're in every day, or a bigger area like an entire planet or some large regions of it anyway. So I don't know, Nate, I'm going to go off the rails on answering your question, but I think there's a lot of flexibility in the genre memoir for a writer, and finding a form that works, or having other readers offer you suggestions during the draft stages of the drafts to help figure out how to tell the stories you want to tell that have something to do about your experience, your own experiences, but also in a way that's interesting. And for me, I felt what I was writing about had to be interesting to me. I mean, I can't write a book that I'm not interested in. So I don't know. There's a bunch of threads. I mean, with more time, I might be able to stitch them together better. Nate, what are those other questions?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm keeping my eye on folks here, but I guess I also wondered, this is kind of connected to that, but I feel like the process of your process, I think, is interesting to me. It's clear that there was a lot of not just memory, but also pretty serious research that went into the book, and so I think that it's helpful for me to think about the interplay between essay and memoir, and how it maybe transition from one into the other one. But do you have thoughts about research? What's your research process, and how you integrated research into the book? And I think that the structure is interesting. You talked some earlier about the structure, but I guess I wonder specifically about your research process.
So the research, okay, so go back to the first part that I read about the road trip going up to the Arctic. So I talk about the pipeline, because you can't drive that highway without seeing that pipeline, unless you're in the fog the whole way, I guess. And I did do some research. Well, what's the pipeline made of? How big is it? How many of those vertical support members are? Just because in my mind, I find the scale of the numbers for industrial projects to be really, really interesting. And there's a lot more that I didn't write about, but that I read about that was interesting, like how they got the stuff up there. And I mean, it just kind of takes your breath away. But at the same time, those big numbers, for some reason, that Running Fence project of Christo's came to mind. And it just was like such an interesting analogy, or a way to write a comparison between something that's industrial and we think of as being pretty permanent, you know, that pipeline until the oil's really is gone, but there's more oil. And something that wasn't even meant to be permanent at all, and yet that went across terrain for a considerable distance. And then the quantity, I mean, how people even first think about that in one's art and one's industry, and the sheer number of things that go into, you know, posts and anchors and poles and that kind of stuff that went into the very temporary running fence art project versus building a pipeline. And so, of course, I had to do research because it was like there was an idea, maybe this will work, to try to draw a comparison in what I'm writing between two things that are in no way alike, except for, I mean, as far as timeline and structure. And I was hoping that that would also get me, give me space to be able to talk about time. One of my headings is time, but time, you know, is, we think of time as history or in the past or what happened yesterday or last year or whatever. But time, economists get really focused on time going into the future, and we have scenarios and projections and try to make educated guesses on what might happen in 10 years or 50 years. So to be able to try to set up, I mean, and whether it worked or not, you know, it probably depends on who reads it and how they think about it. A time-based comparison where one thing that people build, a pipeline, will last quite a long time. And another thing that people build, a structure, is just kind of hilarious and just by definition, very short term. So, and again, I think I've lost the thread of the question, but I want to say also that with this structure in this book, in a way, it seems like by having these little headings that I was ducking writing transitions. But if you read the book, you'll see that I actually, even with the headings to help the reader see, oh, I'm making a thought jump, that I still had to be very careful with writing transitions, a lot of transitions to be able to make, even with the help of the headings, still have it make some sense how the jumps, because I'm giving you jumps in my mind, how my mind jumps from, you know, one thing to another. And I really hope the readers will be able to go along with that. Okay.
Terrific. Thanks, Katie.
Okay.
I think I will let you off the hook at that with that. Thank you very much. Let's all give Katie a hand. Thanks very much for.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
I love Christo, by the way. He's one of my favorite artists. The picture of the island, I think someplace on like the some Italian lake where he had like they had created a bright orange walkway from the Italian lake shore out to some island in the middle of the lake, was my computer desktop background.
Okay,
for years. We did have one question come in just at the very end here. The question is, did Christo create the art with thoughts of the pipeline? Thank you. I appreciated the analogy.
Oh, I can't imagine he did that, but I don't know. That's a really good question. There's on the different websites, there's a lot of references about that running fence project and even like diagrams and stuff. So maybe whoever asked that question can find out the answer to it from some of the Christo oriented websites. You would think he might have. I just don't know though.
Yeah, well, thanks, Katie. Thanks again. And thanks to everybody again here for attending. We will put up the listing, the rest of the summer's calendar for Author's Corner here at the end of the presentation. I will be out in the lobby with copies of Katie's book for anybody who would like to go home with a copy of it. And yeah, thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody in the room. Thanks again to OIT and summer sessions. Katie, yep.
Okay, yeah, before this all ends, I would like to put in one plug for the independent bookstores, and Cabin 135 has been in the pipeline that goes to the, the distributor pipeline that gets to independent bookstores. So you don't have to, like, if you can call the bookstore in your town and they can probably get it for you pretty quickly. So that's my plug.
Terrific. Yeah, echo that for sure. Thanks everybody tuning in online. Thanks everybody in the room. Thanks to UAF, OIT summer sessions, and thanks again to Katie.
Okay,
As
thank
always,
you
it's
so
a-
much, Nate,
a pleasure.
and the press and everyone.